listening to Regenerative Artivism, Asian women's creative strategies for social and ecological futures. I'm your host, Mei Qingwang, an art historian working in contemporary Asian art and the environmental humanities. In each episode, we explore how Asian women artists, curators, and community organizers use creative, place-based practice to confront social and environmental injustice and cultivate the more livable futures. Thank you for joining me. Let's begin.
I want to start today with a feeling many of us likely know, even if we have never put words to it. You arrive in a historic neighborhood because you want something real. You want the texture. You want stories. You want that slightly unscripted sense that you are walking through a living city, not a theme park. And for a few minutes, it works. You catch the smell of incense, likely coming from the famous local temple. You hear local dialect being spoken, and you look up at a roof line that apparently has survived more than one political era. You think, I'm here. Then you turn the corner. There is a line for a photo spot. There is a shop selling the same souvenirs you saw 2 cities ago. There is a crowd moving like a single body, pulled forward by a map and an algorithm. And suddenly, you are not sure what you are looking at. A neighborhood? A product? A stage set? The uneasy switch is the core question of this episode. When does heritage-based regeneration sustain a neighborhood, and when does it slide toward blending and exclusion? To stay honest, this is not a question with a clear answer. It is a question we have to keep asking again and again as conditions change. Today, we ask it through the work of Zheng Dazhen, born in 1981, an independent cultural producer and curator in Quanzhou, Fujian, and the founder of a long-running local network known as the Good Life Creation Society, or SUHU Life. If you have been to Quanzhou's West Street in the last decade, you may have heard her nickname in local media, the West Street Big Sister. It sounds casual, even playful, but it also tells you something important. Her work is not an event that appears and disappears. It is a long presence in a specific place, built through relationship, labor, and a kind of everyday curatorship. This episode is about what it means to curate a good life on a street that is becoming famous, and about the risks that come with the visibility. It is about hospitality as cultural work, and about living heritage not as a museum category, but as a practice of keeping social bonds alive. Let me place us geographically for a moment. Today, Quanzhou is known as a small coastal city of southern Fujian province, but it has a long history as a major port in maritime trade networks. In the account of the 13th century Italian explorer Marco Polo, the port, known as Zheng then, appears as a point of departure from China. In 2021, UNESCO added global recognition with the World Heritage inscription, Quanzhou, Emporium of the World in Songyuan, China. That designation arrived at the moment when the city was already negotiating tourism, development, and identity at the street level. West Street, or Xijie, sits right inside the pressure field. It is the oldest and one of the most walked routes in this ancient city, linking major landmarks and pulling visitors through a dense patchwork of shops, courtyards, temples, snacks, and old houses. And West Street is also where Zheng Dazhen has been building a different kind of cultural infrastructure for more than a decade. To understand her work, we have to let go of a habit many of us have when we think about art. We often look for a single artwork, a single exhibition, a single artist statement that tells us what something means. Zhen's practice does not fit that flame. Her medium is a network of small places and repeatable social forms: a hostel, a tavern, a bookshop, a teahouse, a street market, a pop-up performance, a small exhibition that piggybacks on everyday traffic. This is where I consider her work a form of regenerative artivism. In this podcast, I use regenerative artivism to name practices that do more than represent the crisis. They try to build conditions for ongoing life, social trust, shared knowledge, emotional endurance, and sometimes very practical support systems. In Quanzhou, Zheng's work suggests that regeneration is not only about renovating buildings. It is also about repairing the thin social fabric that makes a neighborhood feel like a neighborhood. But repair, as we know, is never neutral. It happens inside economies, property markets, and power structures. So the question is not only what is being made, but who gets to stay, who benefits, and who gets priced out. Let me back up and give you a clear sense of how Zheng arrives here. A Quanzhou native who grew up not far from West Street, Zheng studied art at Xiamen University, returned to Quanzhou to work in local contemporary art spaces in the late 2000s, and in 2010 founded the Good Life Creation Society as a cultural planning organization. Over time, she shifted from organizing one-off exhibitions toward building a durable neighborhood-facing cultural network. Those details matter because they mark a pivot many cultural workers in small Chinese cities have had to make. If you want to sustain cultural work beyond a single event, you need a model that can pay rent, pay labor, and keep a door open. So instead of only making exhibitions, Zheng builds what we might call a chain of everyday cultural sites. Some of these sites work through hospitality. One is the old post house used in 187, a small lodging space tucked into the old city fabric and oriented toward budget and backpack travelers. Another is the Good Life Tavern, a nighttime gathering point for young creatives after dark. Both were early, even pioneering in Quanzhou before West Street's tourism boom brought a wave of similar venues. They have provided reliable spaces for Zheng to host workshops, book talks, experimental music performances, and film screenings, as well as showcases of local folk arts. Other sites work through learning and informal archiving. Jiezi Bookstore is a place where you can find materials for studying Quanzhou local culture. It rents out and sells books along with other cultural products, and also hosts workshops and other small-scale cultural events. It is not only a place for reading, but also a tiny research station. It holds local texts and even the ancient musical notation system used in Nanjing, a regional music genre that UNESCO added to its intangible cultural heritage representative list in 2009. If you have never seen Nanjing notation, imagine a score that feels like a hybrid of poetry and code. Characters marking pitch and rhythm, carried through generations by community music societies. When that kind of material sits in a street-level bookshop, it changes what heritage means. It is not only a performance on a festival stage. It becomes something you can study, return to, and talk about over tea. And then there are sites that cultivate the slow time. There is a tea house named True Water Leisure House, set in a well-preserved traditional residence with a central skywell. Then use it as a place to meet visitors and collaborators, talk about the projects, and host small cultural events, but also as a statement about the pace, because slow living is one of the values she tries to protect in a street economy built for speed. There are also affiliated small eateries, including a salsa noodles shop and related branding that connect Quanzhou's everyday eating culture to longer histories of maritime exchange. Together, these concrete spaces form the Good Life network that supports and implements her cultural and artistic projects. If you are listening from outside China, you might be tempted to hear this and think, so she is a cultural entrepreneur running charming places on the tourist street. But a couple of practical details complicated that picture. She began building these spaces long before tourism picked up on West Street. And she leases rather than owns them, which means the network is always vulnerable to rent shifts and redevelopment pressure. And yes, she's an entrepreneur. We should not pretend otherwise. But the more interesting point is what she does with entrepreneurship. Her aim is not only to sell an experience, but to build forms of everyday access to culture. In her own words, the goal is to live comfortably in place and to make cultural life feel available, not institutional. The nickname SUHU, used for the Good Life Network, is explained as a local, self-mocking way to say comfortable. The point is not a luxury. The point is a mode of being in the city. So what happens when you treat a hostel or a tavern as a cultural space? A hostel is not just a place to sleep. It is a way to bring outsiders into a local rhythm and give them a slower entry into a city. A tavern is not just a business. It can become a nighttime commons where conversations happen. A bookshop is not only retail. It can function as a small archive, keeping cultural knowledge within reach of daily life. These are modest claims, but in cities under tourism pressure, they become politically significant. Because when heritage becomes a brand, the first thing that often disappears is the unprofitable space where people simply gather. Heritage-led regeneration can easily produce a beautiful street that's no longer livable for its residents. This is not a special problem of Quanzhou. It is a pattern documented across China and beyond. Historic districts can become sites of urban entrepreneurism, where local governments and developers extract value through tourism, real estate, and cultural capital. In this process, the aesthetic of heritage can travel faster than the social life that produced it. Quanzhou's 2021 World Heritage inscription makes this dynamic harder to avoid. It raises the stakes and intensifies the story of Quanzhou must tell about itself. So where does Zheng Dazhen sit inside this? Here is the complicated answer. She's both a counterforce and a participant. She builds programs that keep local practice visible. She invites craftspeople, performers, and makers into the street economy. She creates places where local knowledge is shared. And at the same time, her success can make the street more attractive, more legible, more marketable. This is not a moral failure. It is the structure of heritage regeneration under contemporary urban policy. To see how she navigates the structure, I want to spend time with two recent projects that make her method very clear. The first is an exhibition that happened in a place that usually smells like vegetables and fish. In November 2022, an art project called The Big-Tailed Lantern Dragon opened inside the West Street Market. It was not in a white cube. It was on the second floor of a market building, in a large space that had been sitting empty. At the center was a giant hanging dragon form, about 168 meters long, built from around 240 old lanterns and an assortment of reused materials, fishing nets, old hardware parts, even safety helmets. Zheng served as the curator for this project, and the main installation was made by a Quanzhou-based young artist known as Bao Xiaoge, described in local reporting as someone committed to recycling and reuse. Why a lantern dragon? In many parts of China, lanterns belong to festival time. They carry the charge of seasonal joy, but they are also disposable. After the festival, they become waste, or they sit in storage until they fall apart. Additionally, in southern China, dragon processions are central to the Lantern Festival season, moving through villages and townships as a form of collective blessing and public joy. The big-tailed lantern dragon starts from the problem. What do you do with 240 old lanterns that no one knows how to store? By choosing a dragon shape, the project turns a pile of leftover lanterns into a shared body again, one that implies movement and coordination. It suspends the body over a market floor that has fed the neighborhood for generations. And it asks viewers to look up, not at an ancient monument, but at the afterlife of everyday objects. This is where a regenerative aesthetic actually shows itself, not in a perfectly green message, but in a practical refusal to throw things away, and in a willingness to make public meaning out of what would otherwise be waste. The exhibition ran from mid-November 2022 through the Lantern Festival season in 2023. On weekends, it was open to the public, and it did not stay static. Over time, performances and events were added, puppetry, music, and other small live programs that expanded the exhibition from an object you look at into a social scene you enter. And notice the curatorial choice here. The market is already a place of exchange. People move through it. They talk. They bargain. They listen. By bringing an art installation into the space, Zheng is not just placing art in a new location. She's aligning art with a social habit, the habit of going to the market, the habit of meeting neighbors, and the habit of being among strangers without needing a ticket. That matters because it changes who art is for. In many cities, cultural events arrive as spectacles that ask local residents to become an audience for their own neighborhood. Here, the market remains a market. The exhibition piggybacks on everyday life. But here's what complicates things. The big-tailed lantern dragon generated significant media coverage and became a destination. It became something people traveled to see. It produced images that circulated. It added the street's cultural capital. And cultural capital converts quickly into commercial pressure. More attention can raise rents, reshape storefronts, and pull the street toward a visitor economy that is less tolerant of everyday use. That is the double edge. Now let's move from the market interior to the street itself, and to what happens when street as platform scales up under holiday tourism. In 2023, during the National Day holiday period, a project called the 5 Foot Away Art Market opened on Zhuangyuan Street, a newly renovated pedestrian street in Quanzhou's old city, not far from West Street. It was a multi-day program with dozens of stalls set within a renovated corridor-like street space. If you have ever walked through a Southeast Asian port city with shop houses and covered walkways, you already know the feeling of the 5 Foot Away, a sheltered-edge space where pedestrians move, vendors set up, and social life thickens. Scholars have described the 5 Foot Away as a spatial heritage form that blurs public and private rights, and that creates a distinctive zone of public-private interaction. In Quanzhou, The spatial logic resonates with the city's longer maritime histories and with the lived architecture of old commercial residential streets. The Zhuangyuan Street program included 68 stalls and used the lantern dragon motif again, with a dragon head installation at the entrance and the dragon body corridor effective inside. The program combined local snacks, handmade crafts, intangible heritage products, and cultural creative design. It also included a graffiti wall that visualized local symbols and the book market curated through Xijie bookstore. This is a very specific kind of curatorial work. It treats the street as an exhibition platform, but it does not treat the street as empty. It treats it as already lived. It overlays a cultural market onto an existing street ecology in which people still live above shops and move through the same corridors daily. This is why the risks are so high, because when you curate a street, you can easily curate the residents out of it. In many Chinese cities, including Quanzhou, historic streets become commercial corridors with themed retail, while residents are relocated, rents rise, and the street becomes a stage for visitors. Redevelopment can reshape neighborhoods through policy, investment, and the remaking of urban space for consumption. Zheng's work happens inside the larger landscape, but her method suggests a different ambition. Instead of replacing local life with a single branded image, she builds platforms where multiple micro-economies and micro-stories can coexist. Food vendors, craftspeople, performers, booksellers, tourists, and residents who are not performing anything at all. A follow-up question is unavoidable. What makes this coexistence possible, and how long can it last? Here is one practical clue: repetition. A one-time festival can be absorbed into branding without changing the social structure of a neighborhood. But repeated small events, run by people who are locally embedded, can create social friction against pure commercialization. They make it harder for a street to be only a photo backdrop, because they keep generating situations that require participation, conversation, and time. Time here is the scarce resource. Tourism wants speed, quick consumption, quick images, quick movement. Living heritage needs duration, apprenticeship, repeated practice, the slow accumulation of trust. Zheng's network seems to understand this, not as a theory, but as a daily operational reality. A teahouse exists because someone opens it every day. A bookshop becomes an archive because someone keeps collecting, sorting, and caring for materials. A market becomes a platform because people return again and again. This is not glamorous work. It is maintenance. And maintenance, in a regenerative frame, is often where politics lives. At this point, I want to make one connection to an earlier episode of this podcast, because it helps clarify what is distinctive about Zheng's practice. In our episode on Liu Yang and the Polis Institution, we talked about a museum learning to behave like a neighborhood commons, shifting from a model of cultural authority to a model of shared use, shared learning, and everyday accessibility. Zheng is not working inside a museum, but she's building a Polis institution of her own, stretched across multiple small sites and folded into a historic street. The question in both cases is not only what culture is displayed, but what kinds of social relations culture makes possible. Now, let us stay with the tensions, because that is where the ethics are. From my own observation, it does not take much for a single symbol to start standing in for an entire city. In the past couple of years, for example, the practice of wearing flower hair ornaments, 簪花, surged in visibility and began to concentrate around West Street as a kind of viral image economy that thrives on quick, repeatable photo cues. Some locals are concerned that these symbolic trends can flatten cultural death and push a neighborhood toward a narrow, marketable logo. This is the pressure Zheng's work pushes against. When heritage becomes a logo, the good life becomes something you buy. It becomes a styled experience, a coffee shop with an antique facade, a souvenir with a retro font, a street that looks old but functions as retail. Zheng's projects suggest a different proposition. The good life is not an image. It is a social arrangement. It is the ability to meet someone, to learn something, to sit somewhere without being rushed to spend more, to have cultural knowledge available without needing institutional permission. And yet, this proposition is always at the risk of being captured, because the aesthetic of the good life sells extremely well. So what does it mean, practically, to stay grounded? One answer is to keep making the conflicts visible, rather than hiding them behind slogans. In my conversation with Zheng in 2025, she expressed her deep concern that the tourism boom has negatively impacted the locally rooted small business and everyday local life, undermining what it claims to celebrate. This is a reminder that heritage-based regeneration is not automatically good. It can rebuild social bonds, or it can reroute value upward. The difference often lies in governance, property policy, and who holds decision-making power over space. Zheng does not control those structural factors, but she has been trying to build practices that make a different future more imaginable. If we return to the big-tailed lantern dragon, the gesture is simple. Take discarded lanterns and turn them into a communal spectacle in the market. The materials are humble. The site is ordinary. The result is a collective pause inside the street economy. If we return to the 5-foot-away art market, the gesture is also simple. Use the sheltered corridor of the street as a platform for small makers and local practices, and make the street legible as a living place rather than a packaged one. This is why I think Zheng's work belongs in a conversation about the regenerative aesthetics, even if it does not present itself that way. Regeneration here is not a promise that everything will be better. It is a discipline of keeping multiple forms of life in circulation, craft, performance, informal education, neighborhood hospitality, and the everyday right to linger. But I want to end with a warning that is also a prompt. In heritage districts, the language of regeneration can be seductive. It can make displacement sound like improvement. It can make privatization sound like revitalization. It can make branding sound like care. So the task for us, as listeners, as scholars, and as cultural participants, is to keep asking very concrete questions. Who can still afford to live here? Who is doing the labor of maintenance? Whose culture is being displaced? And who gets to define what counts as authentic? When the project succeeds, where does that value go? If you visit the West Street or any historic street in your own city, you might try a small exercise. Do not only photograph the landmark. Notice the places that people rest without purchasing, the corners where older residents still do daily routines, the tiny shops that are not designed for outsiders, the informal conversations that have nothing to do with tourism. Those are often the fragile sides of the good life. And if you encounter a project like Zheng Dazhen's, resist the urge to reduce it to either celebration or critique. Hold both truths at once. These are real efforts to sustain living heritage and rebuild social bonds. And they operate inside the systems that can easily convert care into profit. That is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to stay awake.
Thank you for listening to Regenerative Artivism, Asian women's creative strategies for social and ecological futures. If this episode brought someone or some places to mind, I invite you to continue that reflection in your own conversations and practices. You can find a short summary and a few references in the episode description in your listening app. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of the places that sustain you.